A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. We have won. What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
I knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
This is the United States government, right, doing something and actually killing its own citizens. For me, the motivation is all in love and prosperity and future, not in, I'm afraid we're all going to die. I think all of us have to have a sense of responsibility towards our ancestors. Like, humans have been on this planet for, let's estimate it at 250,000 years. Everybody had died of one cancer or another. Like grown-ups and adults, we discuss our differences, we negotiate, we cooperate, we compete on athletic fields and in scientific achievements and in musical and artistic achievement. The United Kingdom went to Australia, we went to Kiribati. The United Kingdom also tested at the Nevada test site. Someone like Daniel Ellsberg, this man put his life on the line. He was going to go to prison for the rest of his life. Basically zero research, basically zero compensation, zero acknowledgement. Peace rather than supporting war. How about we be leaders by finding ways to collaborate with other countries? I think the United States should lead this because we are the first country to develop nuclear weapons. We're the only one to use them on cities full of women and children.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Today's guest is Dr. Ivana Hughes. Dr. Ivana is a scientist and a leading voice in nuclear disarmament. She serves as the president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, where she advocates for the abolition of nuclear weapons and the advancement of peace. She's also a senior lecturer in the discipline of chemistry at Columbia University, and she's a director of Frontiers of Science course. With a background in chemistry and a deep commitment to human rights, Dr. Ivana has conducted extensive research on the long-term effects of nuclear testing, including fieldwork in the Marshall Islands. She has also spoken at United Nations forums, including the NPT Preparatory Committee and other events related to Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. She has also been featured in the Huffington Post, Science News, and various other media outlets. Wow. I think you've done some amazing stuff. I think you should leave some of that stuff for the rest of us. I can probably read all of it, but this is just too much. So I'll probably cut it short. Otherwise, I'll be just reading your work for the next half an hour. So welcome, Dr. Ivana. Great to talk to you. And how are you?
Thank you, Ali. Thank you so much for this invitation, for the opportunity to speak to you today, and for that overly kind introduction. I'm really
You're
delighted.
being very humble.
No. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. And yes, thank you so much.
No, likewise. So how does it feel to have a list of accomplishments and achievements longer than the terms and conditions of an insurance company?
Please, no.
It just keeps going and going.
Not at all. No, I think of things that I've done as really as just one human being trying to make a contribution to a better world. That's really how I see things. I guess I could start by just saying a little bit about my own background. I was actually born in former Yugoslavia, in Serbia, and I grew up, had a a lovely, childhood, and my country began falling apart when I was actually a teenager, just very early teenage years. So I was born in '76, and by 1990, things were not looking very good in Yugoslavia. And I even prior to everything that had happened in Yugoslavia, I was sort of dreaming of studying in the United States. I was a kind of precocious student. I especially liked math and science. Interestingly, growing up in Yugoslavia, I never thought there was anything special about me as a girl liking math and science. And I was quickly schooled in the United States that there was something special about that once I was here. But I had this sort of, way of looking at the United States and the educational system here. And it was just a dream that somehow became a reality for me. I came as a sort of, in some sense, managed to get out of Yugoslavia, which at the time was an absolute mess, both in terms of the wars that were going on, but also the economic collapse. So in 1994, I arrived. I was 17 years old. I arrived as a foreign exchange student my senior year in high school. And from then on, I just had sort of a series of, I'm sure I did a few things right here and there, but there were also some really, I was just incredibly fortunate. And so I got to study at Caltech, which is really one of the premier science and engineering schools in the world. I was fully supported by Caltech financially. I had just the most amazing time when I was a student there. It's a very small school, so the attention that the students get, there were 10 of us studying chemical engineering in my year. And the attention that the students get at a school like that, and especially at that time, was just absolutely astounding. I ended up doing my senior thesis with Francis Arnold, who many years later in 2018 actually won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And this fact still astounds me to this day. She was actually the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry. Up to that point, there had been well over 100 years worth of Nobel Prizes given. Now one went to an American woman, and she was the first. And then after Caltech, I went to Stanford for my PhD. It's where I still studied and received degrees in chemical engineering, but my research sort of turned more towards fundamental science. I actually worked with a professor, Dan Hirschlag, in the biochemistry department at Stanford, and he's now a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And so I just really, even now when I look at sort of that period of my life, I just sort of feel like I was incredibly fortunate, incredibly privileged. And I say this to my children. I have 3 children, and they're semi-grown. One is in high school, 2 are young adults. And I've always said to them, with privilege comes responsibility. And so that's sort of how I see my own life rather than, accomplishments. It's like I have an opportunity to contribute positively. And I'm just going to try and take that opportunity as much as possible. And I think that's the best any of us can do. No, not at all. Not at all. And in fact, the interest in nuclear weapons is so. I think it was another kind of fortunate development. All of that happened. I described being at Caltech and Stanford, and my husband. By the time I was doing my PhD, I got married during my PhD. I actually had 2 children during my PhD, so I was always a little busy. Um, And my husband and I moved to Columbia in 2006. He is professor of physics, and I had recently finished my PhD and just sort of took a little time before I was ready. As I said, I had 2 children, and before I was ready to kind of return to scholarly work. And I began teaching in Frontiers of Science, which you mentioned, which is a core science core at Columbia. And it was actually through that course that I first sort of learned about nuclear weapons in a way beyond whatever any of us might know if we haven't actually looked into the subject. And for me, I think there was the kind of added, of course I knew about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Of course I knew even some about nuclear testing, although very, very sort of extremely rudimentary. I knew it took place, but I didn't know much about where and how much and what it had done to people. And then I sort of had a little bit more of a personal experience with Chernobyl because, as I said, I was born in 1976. So in 86, I was 10 years old. I remembered, when the accident happened and sort of how scared people were. Of course, at that time, access to information. I mean, this was not the internet age, right? Access to information was relatively limited, but we knew as a child, I knew that this had happened and that this was really devastating, obviously, to the people living locally, but that really the radiation had spread in other parts of Europe, and so in that sense, there were some kind of touch points to nuclear weapons, but it was absolutely not on my radar when I was an undergraduate, when I was getting my my PhD, and I think it's interesting that it happened to be that I sort of became more aware of this at a place like Columbia. I think Columbia is, of course, there are many amazing universities out there, and Columbia is one of them. But I do think that Columbia is fairly unique in its being located in New York City, which, my father, who's a former judge, and my parents still live in Serbia, always calls it the capital of the world. It's sort of his, way of describing New York. And in some sense, I really agree with that. I mean, and not just because of the United Nations. There's something really, really special and cosmopolitan about New York. Something that's New York is sort of both American and not American, right? Because it's also so different from other American cities. And in that sense, I think Columbia's location in New York sort of lends itself to people thinking about the world in a way that might not be present at other universities. It's also that the university itself attracts students and faculty who are sort of more curious and interested in the world. And again, I think it's sort of not surprising that realization and interest and engagement for me started in New York, started at Columbia, and has now, of course, grown to kind of initially when I was first interested in nuclear weapons, it was actually with my husband, Emily Hughes, who's a professor of physics here. And the two of us were sort of, realizing that the nuclear weapons were actually still this was around 2011. So even before, what began transpiring in Ukraine in 2014 and so on. I mean, at the time that we became interested in nuclear weapons, it was like nobody knew anything about nuclear weapons. In the last few years, you can at least hear that, maybe these arsenals are a little bit of a problem, or maybe something bad could happen. back then, 15 years ago or nearly 15 years ago, it was like, what, nuclear weapons? We still have those? That was sort of what most even, full-grown adults were thinking. And the young people at Columbia and beyond were utterly unaware. I mean, completely unaware of, the nuclear weapons problem. And so our view initially was just to do some more things with Columbia undergraduates to sort of educate them on the topic. And then, of course, that grew into the research that you mentioned on understanding radiological conditions in former nuclear weapons testing sites. And then it was talking about that research that sort of brought me more into this policy arena and into the role at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, where, my role now is a little more sort of public facing and advocacy. So again, kind of leaving the not leaving the college campus, because I still teach at Columbia and I still love Columbia, but taking that interest a little bit more to the broader world.
That's great. So you're trying to convince countries or the leaders of different countries to discard nuclear weapons. How does it feel like working on an unsolvable problem? Is it harder than a 3-body problem?
Well, I think if I thought that it was unsolvable, I probably wouldn't work on it. So and call me eternally optimistic or hopelessly naive. I just refuse to think that if there is something out there that, one, humans have created, and that, two, can quite literally destroy human civilization, destroy our world as we know it. Maybe some life survives. We don't even really know how bad it could be. We absolutely know that our societies as they function today cannot survive nuclear war. And so fine, some life survives, and then it's like one of those science fiction, movies of, I don't even know what the movies are. I don't really watch movies, but other people are far more creative than I am to kind of picture what that world looks like. I want nothing to do with that world, right? So like, I don't even want, so one, we created them. Two, they could destroy our world. And so to me, the logical conclusion has to be that we have to get rid of them. Like, I just don't see how you could come to any other logical conclusion, how anyone could accept really any level of risk and, tell me that it's 1 in a million. And most people think it's far greater than that, right? But if you tell me it's 1 in a million, I still don't think it's a good idea, right? Because to me, this sense of responsibility that I described in my own personal life, I think all of us have to have a sense of responsibility towards our ancestors. Like, humans have been on this planet for, let's estimate it at 250,000 years. That's a lot of generations of ancestors each of us has. There are future generations that somehow we would decide that because US doesn't like Russia and Russia doesn't like the US, or India doesn't like Pakistan and Pakistan doesn't like the US, we're going to destroy human civilization as we know it. Like, that is just not okay. It's not okay. And on top of it, it's really this sort of, there's a professor from Harvard. Her name is Elaine Scarry, and she's written a book. It's a fascinating analysis, in many ways a literary. She's a literary scholar, and in many ways a literary analysis. Her book title is Thermonuclear Monarchy. So she's describing sort of how we live in this monarchy where one person not just gets to decide the fate of their own nation, but gets to decide the fate of humanity. Like the most extreme case of something that is so fully and completely undemocratic. Like there's nothing less democratic than deciding that you're going to press a button, and that button press is not going to lead just to millions of people or hundreds of millions of people dying. It's going to lead to billions of people dying. And I can explain this a little more, like why I use those numbers. I'm not exaggerating anything. This is all based on scientific evidence. And so, so when you say I'm trying to convince leaders, yes, on the one hand, yes. But I think what I'm really trying to do even more is convince the general public, because I think it's only when the general publics of especially the countries that possess nuclear weapons, and we can go through that list, it's when those people stand up and say, no, actually, we don't like being threatened with not just being killed, but having our world annihilated in a way that prevents any future generations from living on this planet, from having a civilized world, from reaching their potentials, having futures, whatever. And we also think that that's just unacceptable to our ancestors. Like we actually respect those many generations who've gone through so many things, right? Where they were dying, for example, of the plague, not even realizing what that meant, or what could have been done to prevent it, or could have been done to who survived on the African savannah, right, in the face of very challenging circumstances in many ways. I mean, it's just, there's so many examples who made it through these wars that we humans, fought and engaged in. And there's so many ways that you look back at history and say, it's kind of a miracle we're here. And for us to threaten that in any shape or form, I just find unacceptable. And I kind of go back to the first points I was making about responsibility. I just feel that I've been privileged enough, and if I have the opportunity to speak about this, I will, as I'm doing with you here. So thank you
No,
again
that's great.
for inviting me.
What's the hardest part of your job then?
Oh, everything is really hard. So I'll tell you what I tell people, especially now that in a way I have two jobs. So I have and it's not unusual for professors to, have their teaching and then have their research or public engagement. I mean, there are many people who do far more than just teach in the classroom. So I'm by no means unique, but I do sort of see this, my internal kind of Columbia job, primarily focused on teaching. Obviously, I interact with colleagues and have other responsibilities, but and then outside of that, this kind of public facing job, when I write or when I speak to people, I'm always introduced as president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and senior lecturer at Columbia University. So it's sort of, both things do come together in that outside world. But I always say to people, I absolutely love teaching, like teaching students. And I know you mentor young people, and I'm sure you feel the same way. I mean, teaching is certainly not something you do. Well, you don't do piecework for the money either, but
I don't think
teaching,
there's any money in peace work.
no,
There's
exactly.
money in war.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But teaching, I don't think anyone, goes into a university career where they either teach, a lot, or it's part of their responsibilities, unless they love teaching, because it's actually, it can be hard and so on. And it's when you love it, it sort of becomes this, feedback loop of like, you want to, help your students, and they help you get better at it, and it's just wonderful. And I really, it's what kind of keeps me going, because interacting with young people is just so special. And I always say at the start of the school year, they just keep getting younger and younger. Because when I first started teaching at Columbia 17 years ago, I was first teaching in a different course. 17 years ago, I started teaching in Frontiers of Science. Before that, I taught general chemistry. The students were far older than my own children. And now, like, I have two children who are older than my students and one who is still younger than them. But it's just like they're so young. They're really young. I teach 18-year-olds. And I really love that. The work with educating and advocating for nuclear disarmament, for nuclear abolition, my work at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, that's really hard. And in some sense, I don't do it because I don't want to say I don't love it, but I don't love it, right? Like, I do it because I think it's just so important. If I weren't teaching at Columbia, somebody else wonderful would be teaching, and they would be, like, my students would be fine if they didn't have me. In nuclear disarmament, as you said, there are not that many voices. I mean, it's just a hard thing. It's hard to run these organizations. It's hard to get funding. It's hard to even feel like you're, at times, it's hard to feel like you're making a difference. So I think there are many kind of pressures on that entire community. And I don't want to make it seem like there aren't other people. There are plenty of other people working. It's just that it's still for an issue that important, it's still a very small and definitely underfunded community. Like, you compare that to the issue of climate change, which, don't get me wrong, I'm completely, I actually teach more about climate change in Frontiers of Science than I do about nuclear weapons. But there's definitely a kind of civil society presence on climate change that's felt. Now, have we done enough? Of course not. But I still feel like there's a strong movement there. The nuclear disarmament movement, which had, probably two big success periods. One was in the 60s, and one was in the 80s. In the 60s, the big success was the passing of the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963. That was President John F. Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev coming together after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which quite literally, I mean, we now know so many details about what transpired during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, you and I would not be here today. There would be, no podcasts, no cell phones, no, nothing, and probably not you and me either. Had that, gone the wrong way. And they came together and wanted to sort of do more. And the first step was ending the atmospheric testing, which had been devastating people, in particular from United States, and UK, but also Soviet testing. The US at that point, by 1963, had tested in the Marshall Islands, had tested also in another small Pacific island state called Republic of Kiribati. The US had also tested about 100 atmospheric bombs, not about 100 atmospheric bombs at in Nevada. And the fallout from all of those had impacted people. The fallout from the Nevada tests actually reached virtually every corner of the United States and even parts of Canada and Mexico. And then the Soviets had actually many locations where they tested and exploded nuclear weapons, but there were two prominent ones. One was in Kazakhstan, and one was up in the north, a region called Novaya Zemlya, basically in the Arctic. So the nuclear testing had done tremendous damage, and JFK and Khrushchev came together. And what had to happen in the United States is the Senate needed to actually ratify this treaty. The senators were absolutely not interested in this. And then JFK went around the country basically on a kind of public campaign for just 2 months. He talked about strontium 90, which is one of the radioactive isotopes that's actually similar to calcium. He talked about it being present in the baby teeth, which was absolutely had been documented by that point for American children. And he got the general public on his side, and then the senators lined up, and the final vote for that treaty was 81-18. And, that combination of kind of leadership and general public's involvement was really key. And then something not quite analogous, but it's kind of similar levels of increased public engagement happened in the 1980s when Reagan came into power. I mean, he was like the super cold warrior, and he was going to do all these, increase the arsenals, and they were increasing the arsenals. By 1986, the worldwide nuclear arsenals, mostly from US and Soviet Union, had reached 70,000 nuclear warheads. Right now in the world, we have about 12,500. So we've come way down from that time. But those arsenals could have destroyed the world over and over and over and over and over again. And people were marching in Central Park in June of 1982. There were 1 million people marching against the nuclear arms race. And, it turns out that Reagan actually wasn't impacted by that march and those specific general public events. What is frequently described is that he, alongside about 100 million Americans in 1983, watched the film The Day After. And that film ended up kind of telling the story of nuclear war breaking down between the US and Soviet Union. I watched it not that long ago. It's actually not very good. Maybe just 40 years of the development of film technology. It's like you're watching and then you're going, wow, this convinced him. It was pretty mild. I mean, obviously people die and things explode and people have radiation burns and so on, but it's not exactly the most convincing. But I guess he was really moved by it. He was really convinced, and that turned him to try to talk to Gorbachev. Turns out Gorbachev had been impacted by listening to what civil society was saying in those rallies in the Central Park 1982 event. And so the two of them came together, and by 1986 they were in Reykjavik saying nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And then, within a few years, the Soviet Union it collapses peacefully as well. And so in many ways, I think we can attribute this. We can consider that time period to have been successful, at the very least, in reversing the arms race. What's interesting is that when they were in Reykjavik, Reagan and Gorbachev had come very, very close to actually agreeing to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. And if they had succeeded then, I mean, we would be living in a different world. Now, some people think that I'm the naive one and we would be living in a world filled with war, but the point is that these weapons have not prevented wars. We've had many, many wars. We've had millions of people dying since World War II. And the point is, can we actually get to a place where, like grown-ups and adults, we discuss our differences, we negotiate, we cooperate, we compete on athletic fields and in scientific achievements and in musical and artistic achievements. And Europe has this Eurovision. When I was growing up, we always watched Eurovision. It's like a music competition between different countries, and it's always a big deal. Like, let's have a world vision. Let's totally satisfy our desire to win and but let's not do it by killing people. My goodness, like, what are we doing? Again, in the 21st century, where here you and I are, you're in Australia, I'm in New York, and we can have this conversation. Like, can't we just use that as a model for solving our differences? So anyway, I don't know what you asked me
No, that was
initially,
a good
but
answer.
I hope that
I
was
think it's very
helpful.
difficult to solve the problem when there's money involved. But you mentioned that there was fallout from nuclear testing in Nevada.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you mean by that? I mean, was there any
Oh, yes.
significant
Absolutely.
radiation levels in America because of that?
Significant radiation all throughout the United States. Of course,
Right.
most impact relatively close. There's an area in Utah that was impacted very severely just because of how the winds blow and how the mountain range was like, once fallout had gone to a certain area, and then a mountain range just sort of prevented it from spreading farther, and also has to do with, again, winds, but also weather events. So, like, if you have this mushroom cloud, it goes up into the atmosphere, it starts blowing with the wind, and then if there's a weather event somewhere, it rains, it snows, it whatever, then that radiation comes down. And that's a lot of that is just entirely random, right? So it's like you just got lucky that there was rain in your town the day that this fallout, cloud had reached, your region. And so there are maps that people have made. It's a map from a book by someone named Robert Mueller, who basically has a map of the United States, and his analysis was something like places where at least 3 fallout kind of clouds, winds crossed. And then I think he also analyzed for precisely the weather events I was just describing. And when you look at the map, it's as if a child had been like splashing paint onto the map, right? So like it's not like, oh yes, it got to half of the United States and then the eastern part was fine. It's basically everywhere. It goes even to upstate New York. And then on top of that, the Nevada tests again were really devastating and impacted communities. There's a really good friend of mine and just a wonderful woman who's former journalist, author, activist. Her name is Mary Dixon. She's from Salt Lake City in Utah, and she talks about the neighborhood where she grew up, where she no longer has anyone alive who was a child with her at that time. Everybody had died of one cancer or another, one immune disease or another. I mean, just absolutely devastating stories. And this is the United States government, right, doing something and actually killing its own citizens. And then on top of this, we've all been impacted by kind of worldwide deposition. That mostly came from tests done elsewhere, for example, in the Pacific, in places like Marshall Islands and Kiribati, the really, really powerful hydrogen bombs. So in Nevada, we actually only tested atomic bombs. We referred to fission weapons, the ones that work with plutonium or uranium, where the element splits and energy is created that way. We refer to those as atomic bombs. Hydrogen bombs work on the process of fusion, which is also what happens in the sun. It's how the sun works, how the sun gives us energy. So we got to love that process. It's a wonderful process, just not when used to explode bombs. And what hydrogen bombs can do is they can be thousands of times more powerful than atomic bombs. The one whose consequences we were studying in the Marshall Islands, the Bravo bomb, was 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. So Hiroshima bomb was the equivalent of 15 kilotons of TNT. The Bravo bomb was 15 megatons, so 15 million tons of TNT equivalent. That mushroom cloud was 25 miles high or 40 kilometers high, 60 miles wide or 100 kilometers wide. I mean, this is just, it's unfathomable. We can't even imagine, it evaporated an island. It created a crater at the bottom of the ocean that today is about 60 meters deep, and it was far deeper. It's been filling in for these. Bravo was in 1954, so it's been almost 70 years since. I mean,
I want to
over
talk to you
70
about
years since. Yeah.
I want to talk to you about Marshall Islands, but just before that, so has the United States government done anything to prevent further testing, or are they still carrying out testing?
There's been no atmospheric testing or underground testing in the United States since, I believe, 1992. Yeah, so that part is good. We still do something called subcritical tests, and that, of course, is tied to being able to further develop nuclear weapons. So, on the one hand, we've stopped directly harming people, although people who were harmed back in the day are still suffering those consequences, including their descendants, whether it's just physical or mental or other types of harm. But the basically the atmospheric testing, the test ban treaty that I mentioned in 63, the only countries that stopped testing then were United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom. France and China actually continued to test in the atmosphere because they were just around that time kind of getting their programs off the ground. France already had a nuclear weapon and was testing in Algeria, and then they moved their operations to French Polynesia, to the Pacific. And France continued to test until 1974. And China continued to test in the atmosphere. China, at the very least, you could say they hurt their own citizens, but they tested on their own, inside their own territory. These other United States and United Kingdom. United Kingdom went to Australia, it went to Kiribati. United Kingdom also tested at the Nevada test site, in sort of collaboration with the Americans. And so anyway, so China continued to test in the atmosphere, and then everybody was doing underground testing into the 1990s. And then we basically negotiated this comprehensive test ban treaty that the United States never ratified. A group of other countries never ratified it either. which means that the treaty's not in force, but it's been largely followed. The types of testing that it bans have in fact not been going on. Now, India and Pakistan, of course, tested their weapons once they developed them in the late 90s, and then North Korea has been the only one to test in this century. And so in some sense, those things can be described as success stories. The problem is that today we have nine nuclear armed states, so 9 countries that possess nuclear weapons. That's obviously just a lot more fraught. The Cold War was more or less United States versus Soviet Union. Now there are 9 players, and that makes things very, very challenging, very dangerous. But the other thing is that because the arsenals were initiated and developed so long ago, these countries now feel like they have to modernize their arsenals. The United States has plans to spend up to $2 trillion on modernizing its arsenals. I mean, this is where the insanity starts. And then you begin to worry that they're actually going to go back to some kind of testing and what that could do. And since that treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, is not in force, it's not something that they're legally, obligated not to do. Interestingly, Soviet Union had ratified the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and Russia sort of continued with that. And then in just the last year or so, Russia left that treaty, seeking to have parity with the United States on all nuclear issues. And their explanation was that, the United States is not a party to the treaty, so we're going to leave the treaty as well. The United States, instead of saying, oh, no, hold on, stay there, we're going to join you. Like, we get it. You're right. We should be a party to the treaty too. No, President Biden got up and criticized Russia for leaving the CTBT, which was the height of hypocrisy. Like, how do you criticize someone for leaving a treaty that you're not a part of? I mean, it's sad, actually. And that they think that the general public is just going to buy that. Like, yes, bad Russia. Why did you leave the CTBT? Oops, we're not a party of to the treaty. So anyway.
No, it's actually sad that America is not taking lead in this CTBT. Otherwise, more countries could have joined.
Yeah, it's taking a lead in it. It's taking a lead on the nuclear disarmament in general that is so desperately needed from the United States. One, for the kinds of reasons that me, the hopeless, naive, peacenik and optimist, I think the United States should lead this because we are the first country to develop nuclear weapons. We're the only one to use them on cities full of women and children. We wrote the playbook for the nuclear testing era, starting with the starting with the Trinity test in New Mexico and then heading to the Marshall Islands. 6 months later, we were in the Marshall Islands on Bikini Island telling Bikinians to leave their island so that we could end all wars, by testing these weapons, absolutely devastating them for decades. And I know you want to talk about that, and I'm happy to talk about that. But this is the country that like, quite simply has to have that that moral and ethical backbone and realize, like, yeah, we really, you know what, we actually really screwed up on this, and we gotta get humanity out of this mess. We gotta get us out of the mess that we created. And the good news is, it's not a hard mess to get out of. It's a mess that you need political will for. But once you have the political will, you know how to eliminate these arsenals. As I told you, in 1986, we had 70,000 nuclear warheads. Today, we have 12 and a half. We clearly know how to get rid of them, right? So we can go down. But the other piece of why the United States should absolutely be leading the world on nuclear weapons, and that goes, not against what I was just saying, but it's a completely different argument. It is that the United States is uniquely vulnerable in a world full of nuclear weapons. It's vulnerable not just to Russia and China, which you could call its peer or near peer adversaries. It's vulnerable to North Korea, which is a tiny, poor country. And North Korea has an estimated 50 nuclear warheads. They have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach any part of the United States. Like, why would you want to be in a world where your country could be destroyed in a matter of minutes? That's another thing about nuclear weapons. Like, when we talk about things like climate change, absolutely dangerous, totally existential, but it's over the long haul. It's, flares up in local places, and then we, have storms or wildfires, and then we go in and we try to help and solve things. And then, there's a different problem. And over the long term, it could be incredibly dangerous if sea levels rise, if all the ice melts. Like, there are lots of things to worry about. But solving that problem is more complicated, definitely. I don't want to say it's insolvable. It absolutely is, but it's complicated, and it's going to require really figuring out how to do and what to do and where to do it and so on. Nuclear weapons it's not a hard problem to solve if you have the political will. If you actually admit that these weapons pose a threat to all of humanity, as opposed to, quote unquote, keep us safe, which is utter nonsense, because something that can destroy all of humanity, and that, regardless of probability, we all know, everyone I speak with says something. I say, like, but this could, like, if nuclear deterrence, we haven't talked about this term, but this idea that, I have nuclear weapons because you do, and if I have nuclear weapons, you won't attack me, and that sort of thing. And you could say nuclear deterrence has been working, but nuclear deterrence could fail. It could fail because of an accident. It could fail because someone thinks they're under attack, like we call that miscalculation. Someone thinks they're under attack, and so they attack first because they don't want to be, attacked without retaliating. Um, when I say things, whether it's diplomats or other people who've been convinced in the wisdom of nuclear deterrence, when I say, but nuclear deterrence could fail, they go, yeah, of course. And then I say, and then what? And they're like, oh yeah, but it's not gonna fail. It's like, if it's okay, it's okay for me to get on a plane and think that I have some, I don't know, 1 in 200 million flights or something, and has a serious accident. Maybe that's the right number, maybe it's not. But, like, if I die, like, yeah, of course that would be sad, and of course my family would be devastated, but I can take some odds and, sort of live with that. What odds are acceptable with the future of humanity? Like, I don't see any number that someone can show me where I'd be like, oh yeah, you're right. Maybe if they said it's 1 in, 10 followed by 20 zeros, maybe I'd be okay. But clearly, with these enormous arsenals, with the tensions we have today, the geopolitics are terrible. Like, we have real wars, we have real conflicts, we have real tensions. and they all think we can just keep going with the nuclear arsenals, like there's nothing is at stake here. The future of humanity is at stake.
So how do you get rid of a nuclear weapon? If we've managed to reduce from 70,000 to 12,000 something, how did they manage to do that? Where does the weapon go?
You dismantle it. You just have to dismantle all the parts, and you're left with some radioactive material that can either go into waste, or has even, there are examples from that history of end of the Cold War where actually the United States took in um, material from Soviet dismantled nuclear weapons and used it in its nuclear power plants. That was a program called megatons to megawatts, or megatons into megawatts. Um, and so that's one example. I'm actually not a proponent of nuclear energy, but I'd much rather dismantle the weapons first and do whatever needs to be done. I mean, it is a problem, right? Like, is the waste a problem? Absolutely. Are the warheads more of a problem? Absolutely. So, it's at some level, it's choosing your battles. When I talk to people on this topic, I often don't get to make a point, and I just thought of it now, that I care really, really deeply, and obviously I'm very focused on the issue of nuclear weapons, but it is an issue that's sort of embedded in so many other things that we could be doing differently with our world. I mean, yes, the peace portion that I was, alluding to, and let's compete, in world vision and the Olympics, et cetera, et cetera. Um, it's how we spend, for the United States, how we spend taxpayer money. Like, why are taxpayers paying all this money? And it's not just for nuclear weapons, it's these enormous military budgets. Over $1 trillion in the United States goes annually to the military. And meanwhile, you have crumbling infrastructure, you have no universal health care, you have people complaining about the cost of food. I get it. I live in New York City. I mean, I get what I deserve for living in New York City. I mean, everything is so expensive. And so here we are, spending $1 trillion a year like it's nothing, while people in the country are really, really suffering on so many fronts. And I think it's so emblematic of, a real kind of just, I don't want to call it lack of concern, but just ignoring the needs of the working class and the middle class. And when we talk about these billions and trillions being spent on military, that's not like the soldier who enlisted, right, is getting this, plush salary and amazing equipment. I mean, maybe they're getting some good equipment and so on, but this is going to, the vast majority of this money is going to the military contractors. It's going to companies that are building these things. And in the United States, we build intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we build fighter jets, and we build nuclear weapons. I was in Japan in August, and I mean, it was such an amazing, inspiring visit. But one of the things that was so incredible was just how technically advanced the civilian infrastructure is in Japan. Like the bullet trains, the incredible sort of subway system in Tokyo, and public transportation in other cities we were in. Toilets,
Toilets,
yeah,
yes, I know.
like the
And
United States has nothing like this. And
yeah,
yet again, like we have the fighter jets. Like, how about we actually worry a little bit more about the quality of life for people? Japan also has incredible universal health coverage,
correct.
and it's very, very, very much intertwined with where your priorities are and who is the money going to, and just having this kind of new class. Like, this is not even, we have this new class of people who are not just billionaires. They're like, they have like hundreds of billions of dollars, and I so often wonder, for what? Like why? Like that there has to just be a number, on your screen or on some financial statement, as opposed to anything that could in any way materially change the way that person lives their life, and to leave the rest of the population wondering about how they're going to pay the rent or mortgage or health care bill or food bill the next time around. Is it just, to me, just seems so utterly and completely cruel and misguided, and again, going back full circle to nuclear weapons, a recipe for end of humanity. Like, how does any of that make any sense? I
Correct.
think it's
Correct.
really, really, really a terrible time, a really
Yeah.
terrible time.
From the outside, it does feel like America doesn't really care about its own people. It just cares about its own strength, or showing off its own
Yeah,
strength. That's the feeling that we get from outside of America. I did an interview with James Bradley. He wrote that book, Flags of Our Fathers, which was
I don't
later,
know. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
made
Go
into a
ahead.
movie. I uploaded the video just before our
Okay,
conversation today.
perfect. So I'll
He
watch it.
also talks about some of the same things that you were talking about, huge military budgets and wars and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Um and his
And,
father actually raised the flag in Iwo Jima, so
oh wow.
he's personally invested in that.
Sure,
And
sure,
yeah, his
sure.
latest book is coming out on Vietnam, which is why I talked to him day before yesterday. And he also echoes some of the same things that you are saying right now.
Yeah,
I guess it's the priorities.
yeah,
Uh, it's not
absolutely. Can
just
I
in
just can
Japan;
I
it's
just
in Korea, yeah, and in China also. The feeling that I get is they care about the people more. And also, everybody has a different way of governing their people. Some like it, some don't. But from outside, you get a feeling that there's something wrong with the American government or American management, the way they treat their own people, I guess. Yeah.
yeah,
Because once
yeah,
you get involved into, I guess, capitalism combined with very powerful people, they're just going to make more and more money at the expense of the people who are not that well off,
yeah,
and
yeah,
the
yeah,
money
yeah.
always flows up, basically. So yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's what's
no.
happening. Yeah,
A few thoughts on everything you just said. The
yeah,
first is, and I apologize. I was at one point trying to interrupt you because you said something I thought was really important, and I don't want to lose
yeah.
that thought. You said, America cares about its strength. Is that strength though? Like, are we strong? Like, what the heck? Like, I don't feel like we're strong as a country, as a society. Again, if you take into account that a country like North Korea could destroy the United States as we know it, like, that's not strength, right? That's like, you spend over $1 trillion a year on your military, and then you are completely and totally vulnerable. Like, that's insanity. That's not, a good investment. You could invest a fraction of that military budget into really good diplomacy, into things, visionary programs, maybe new ones. JFK was the one who started the Peace Corps, and the idea was, you send these young Americans into developing countries, and you like buy goodwill, and you people contribute and make friends and think of America as someone who is helping them, as opposed to, someone who's telling them what to do. This is kind of fairly well known I think in the UN world, where, for example, African countries will say, yeah, China will come and build us a hospital, and and give us a hospital, and the United States will come and give us a lecture. Like they'll just like wag their tail and tell them what they're doing wrong. And so again, you could do so much more with, like, if you want strength, you want to be the best, lead through peace, lead through negotiations. Don't accept civilians or military people. Like, the war in Ukraine has had relatively few civilian deaths. It still has had, thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers dying. Like, that should not be just something that, well, let's keep going into war. Of course, obviously, and this is one where the public sentiment in the United States has really been changing and shifting around Gaza and the devastation that we've been watching for basically 2 years now. That would be strength. And I think, in some sense, part of the reason that Trump won the election was he was saying some of those right things. Like, he was like, yeah, day one, I'm going to end the Ukraine war, and Gaza's going to, that war is going to end before I even come into office. Of course, none of that has happened, right? But I think he was capturing something that the American general public is desperate for, which is, hey, like, it's okay for us to be a leader, but how about we be leaders in negotiating peace rather than, supporting war? How about we be leaders by finding ways to collaborate with other countries and not just, to increase tensions with them? The other side of this is the fact that we really do have, put nuclear weapons aside and put wars aside, we have other real problems, like climate change, like loss of biodiversity, like AI, which of course has many good things, but it could potentially have some really bad things, like pandemics. We saw what happened in 2020, and that wasn't even the worst of it. Like, you could have a far worse pandemic than that one. For all of that, you actually need international and global cooperation to address and solve those issues. You can't be living in a world where wars are a constant, and every day we hear about how many people got killed in this place or how many people got killed in this other place. Not to mention, even just at the most simple level, like the places where infrastructure is destroyed, buildings are razed to the ground, all these bombing campaigns. Like, you have to actually environmentally, like, I don't even want to renovate my kitchen because I think it's a huge environmental, like, my kitchen works just fine, like, I don't need a new kitchen, right? And we like raise things to the ground and then have to hopefully rebuild them. That's a lot of wasted, right? I mean, that's a huge toll on the environment. And we have this one planet. Like, it's not like Mars is not going to happen for us anytime soon, nor is interstellar travel. I mean, this is it. And also, going back to the points I was making about ancestors and future generations, like, we owe it to all of them to do the right thing by the planet. To none of these billionaires are going to take those billions to the grave. Like, hey, how about we actually, like, find ways to direct some of those resources towards you can still have your yacht and your mansions and stuff. Like, I'm not gonna confiscate anything from anyone, but like we really have problems that really need to be addressed. And I think in the United States, so much of the discourse now is on these, is on sort of like culture wars type topics, right? Which I don't even want to discount. I don't want to say the only thing we should be talking about is nuclear weapons and climate change. Obviously, people want to talk about different things, but when we make, the existential so far from people's consciousness because they're too busy thinking about our differences and who hates whom and why, um, and who's right and who's wrong. Like we're just losing the opportunity to actually address things. I'll just say one more thing in response to your comments. As I described at the very beginning, I came to this country in 1994 initially. That mid 1990s, I mean, of course, President Bill Clinton's, legacy is quite complicated. Lots to say there that I won't. I'm not even a political scientist, so it's not like I want to, litigate, his legacy specifically. And there were certainly things that happened in terms of the economy, the devastation of manufacturing in the United States, I think had a really big impact on kind of where things went for the country. But when I first came here, this was I felt like this was such an optimistic country. This was, people were excited for the future. I think people were excited for, were certainly my generation, those of us in college at Caltech, like we were not, um, I don't think we weren't thinking about we were thinking about our own lives, about building our own futures. We were thinking about things like getting good jobs and having families for young people today, it's such a, it feels like everything is so unstable that, instead of thinking about getting good jobs and having families, and I'm not saying everyone has to have a family. I just think that if people want a family, they should be able to think of that, in their 20s and even early 30s without feeling like, oh my God, I couldn't possibly, right? Like I can barely afford my rent and my food bill and my whatever other expenses I have. How could I possibly now get married and also have children? And then you hear the childcare costs and you hear the, you know, other costs families are dealing with. I do think that that's, it's very, very problematic. And I think that in some sense, it's not just in the United States, but it's perhaps like we see it and feel it because the United States has so much impact on the world still, for better or worse. And then the last point I'll make is that what's interesting to me, and again, I came in that very optimistic moment, I think, in the United States because the Cold War was over, because, um, and the United States had won, right? Like that would be the interpretation of that moment. But it's so interesting to look at how, um, and Donald Trump has been selling this point all along, make America great again. And of course, we can litigate all the things that were wrong in the United States in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, right? Of course we can. And there were plenty of wrong things. But there were elements of the economy that were very different than today, like the very famous comparison of CEOs were making 30 times more than the average or lowest paid worker, and today they make more than 300 times more than the average. So that kind of income inequality, and I've often thought that this is, really an actual consequence of the end of the Cold War, that during the Cold War, the United States had this adversary in the Soviet Union, which had this completely different system of communism, of course. And of course, we all know that that failed and didn't work out, and that's okay. But I've always felt that, like, that existence, that quote unquote threat of communism, at least kept the US capitalism somewhat honest. Somewhat honest. Maybe it wasn't, and maybe there were other problems, how, for example, racial minorities were treated or how women were treated, and so on. Again, I don't want to paint it as it was all perfect, but there were elements of how the economy was set up, the high taxation rates, that quite simply disappeared, starting with Reagan, but then really just, even the decimation of manufacturing that I mentioned, that I think it's not like I'm saying, we should have a Soviet Union again to make the United States honest. I just think the United States should be honest without having a threat of an alternative, economic system. And that we quite simply, have to solve the kind of deep rooted problem of what is a government for and who is it for, and with that some solutions will come very, very easily. Like, yeah, maybe as a government you don't want to spend $1 trillion on the military, and instead you actually want to invest in your civilian infrastructure, in your people's healthcare, in all kinds of other things.
I think the problem starts when you've got lobbying, and government always works for the lobbyists. It's not that you're spending 1 or 2 trillion on military; it's that you have to take loans every year. Mm-hmm. So I think America is $37 trillion in debt. I think the interest payments alone are 1.8 trillion every year, or something like that. Yeah. So again, you're taking loan every year, and you have to pay it back someday. Yeah. So that's
I know. It's devastating. You're absolutely right that actually that bill trumps, and there was no debt basically at the end of, if I have my dates correct, at the end of Bill Clinton's,
very little.
Very little debt. So basically, 25 years, and you could take that back to the start of the wars in the Middle East, starting with Afghanistan, starting with Iraq. Correct. I mean, those wars were devastating. I guess there are now questions about 9/11, but even if you take just the official narrative of 9/11 and you just go with that, was it right to do what we did in Afghanistan? I don't buy it, and I think the jury is not out on Iraq. I think the jury is absolutely in, and it was absolutely not just a mistake. I mean, it was an absolute tragedy what we did.
The United Nations said that it was an illegal war at that point. I think it was Kofi Annan who said this is an illegal war, but everybody went along because
and
Halliburton, again, the point that James Bradley made in the video that I uploaded just before this conversation, he made the same point. Most of the money went to companies, corporations.
Yes.
And those companies have existed in one form or another after, World War II. They were in Vietnam War as well. And they were in Iraq War. They were in Afghanistan War. Yeah. Same company, different name. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, the Vietnam War, I sort of became interested recently in just learning more about the Vietnam War, because of course it happened basically, I was born right after it ended, and obviously I knew some things about it, but I've watched some films recently about it, and have been reading some books. I mean, that just, and even knowing about Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers. He was actually a very close friend of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and in just the last few weeks of his life, he passed away in 2023. We actually held you might enjoy listening to this conversation. I can send it to you.
Sure.
We held a conversation with him and Noam Chomsky and Professor Richard Falk,
Right.
who's someone else you might want to contact. He's a dear friend of mine and one of the absolutely most brilliant people I've ever met in any shape or form. But someone like Daniel Ellsberg, having had like really high level security clearance and access to all these documents that he then photocopied and released to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and put his life on the line. I mean, when you talk about, oh, I've done these impressive things, I've done nothing. I mean, this man put his life on the line. He was going to go to prison for the rest of his life, and thankfully the Nixon administration screwed up the whole trial too badly because they broke into his doctor's office and illegally took some files from there to attack him in court, and so the whole case was dismissed and he went on to live another, over 50 years as a
That's
free man,
great.
and actually as a nuclear disarmament activist. Probably first and foremost, he was doing other things, but this was really, really important to him. So that's also the kind of legacy we have. We have people who've done so much and put so much on the line to do the right thing, and his view was, of course I can spend the rest of my life in prison if it means saving countless, not just Americans, but I mean, that war killed on the order of 2 million Vietnamese people. And I think the number for the United States was 58,000, 58 or
Yeah.
59,000. I mean, just devastating, and all for a lie. And they knew it was a
Yeah.
lie, like
Yep.
basically all along.
But there was a reason why they went to war, and if you listen to that, video, you'll know it's all
Yeah, what did he say?
corporations.
I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'll send you a
corporate.
link.
Yeah, military. Which, of course, Eisenhower leaves office, right, in 1960 and
Yeah.
says in his last speech, beware of the military-industrial complex. I have friends who have a much longer phrase. I don't even know, Micmac, military-industrial Congress, media, whatever, like advertising, something else, like everyone's in on this, right?
Yeah. But even
And
Eisenhower couldn't dismantle that military-industrial complex.
sure,
He felt powerless as well. He had 2-3 years to do that.
sure,
He
sure.
even couldn't do that. So yeah, I mean,
You know what's really interesting about Eisenhower? You know what he was president of before he was president of the United States?
no. No.
Columbia University.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. Back to the beginning of our conversation about Columbia being a special place. It really is.
Yeah.
Columbia
Yeah.
hired him to be president of the university after World War II, and then he became president of the country
Yeah.
from that post. I don't think any of the current university presidents are going to make it to president of the United States.
Not in the
Uh,
current climate, I
Not in
think.
the current, no, no, no,
Yeah.
no, not the current batch.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about the Marshall Islands study
Oh,
that you did. So
sure.
you went there physically and you did testing
Yeah,
yourself.
I've actually been to the Marshall Islands twice, but I only traveled to Majuro. It was my husband, Emlyn, with a group of students. They traveled to the northern Marshall Islands on a boat. These trips were actually a few weeks long because it takes a long time to get to these islands. And at the time, like this was beginning 10 years ago, our children were young. So my husband and I couldn't both travel. And the decision was he was going and I was staying. Maybe a little traditional, but it's okay. It works for us. But I have been to the Marshall Islands, and yes, they visited the islands. What I often describe is there were sort of two things that were kind of key. One is they didn't eat any food on the islands that they visited in the northern Marshall Islands, whether we found evidence of radiation or not, they didn't eat any locally grown food. The other thing is that the kind of background, like they would visit an island for a few hours, for example, the kind of background gamma radiation that they were getting exposed to was would have been significant if they stayed there and lived there for a year, right? An exposure, the kind of external exposure they got just from being there for a few hours was very minimal. In fact, I had calculated that even compared to the most radioactive spots, which were specifically in Bikini Island, they had received less radiation from being there for a few hours, far less actually, than they received just from flying from the United States to the Marshall Islands. So flying from the United States to the Marshall Islands will give you some dose of external gamma radiation. Any flight will do that, but obviously the longer the flight and the higher you up in the atmosphere, the more gamma radiation you get exposed to. So that's one thing about being there. It was fine to visit. It was fine. It wasn't actually like they were just covered in. One place where they were more careful was an island called Runit, which is in Eniwetok Atoll, where, having done a cleanup for a period of about 2 years in the Eniwetok Atoll, the U.S. military and contractors dumped the radioactive material in a crater and then filled it, made a concrete dome on top of it, and that's called the Runit Dome. And that there they were more careful about being there and so on, because once you're dealing with waste, things could be concentrated, there could be things leaking and so on. But the other islands where it's just fallout, it's very high levels of background gamma radiation on some islands like Bikini Island, but that's only dangerous if someone is really living there full time. And very interestingly, it's actually not equally dangerous for everybody. So we actually know from data from Japan that there are disproportionate impacts of radiation on women and children. So the younger you are, the higher the chance that exposure to radiation will lead to cancer later in life. And also that the curve for men and women is different, with women always being at a higher risk of getting cancer regardless of the age of exposure, which is really, I mean, it's another, very, very kind of hidden fact,
Yeah.
something that's very much not common knowledge. It's actually an American biologist. Her name is Mary Olson, who's done these analyses based on data that the U.S. National Academy of Sciences had been collecting on the victims of the Japanese atomic bombings of
Okay.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Okay. So there was a documentary, The Coming War on China. You might know Darlene Keju Johnston. She was an activist like you. She wasn't a scientist. She was from Marshall Islands. She unfortunately passed away in 1996.
Kathy
Sorry?
Kathy Jednal Kitchener, is that the name you said? Or?
No, Darlene Keju
Darlene.
Johnston.
Oh yes, of course I know who Darlene was. Yes, of course.
She was in the documentary The Coming War in China. Again, James Bradley, he's also in that documentary. That's how I come to know about Darlene as well. They talk about Marshall Islands and the nuclear testing, and then they move on to China after that. But so
Darlene,
she also...
Darlene, I've read her book, so Don't Ever Whisper. She wrote a book about her activism, Don't Ever Whisper. It's just a brilliant book, and um, she was married to Giff Johnson, who
Yeah.
is the editor of the Marshall Islands Journal, whom I know very well, and Giff is a wonderful man. And
Yeah.
she was a force of nature, absolutely incredible.
Yeah. No. So I think she was doing the same. So what was the outcome of your Marshall Islands study?
Yes, so our research, I think it's actually had quite a bit of impact. Our research showed very conclusively that parts of the Marshall Islands were really still not uh, safe for, and the way I describe this is for a multi-generational community to live in full time. Hence some of what I said, you can go and visit for a few hours and get back on a boat and leave. That's not gonna increase your risk of cancer, an appreciable degree. But for a multi-generational community to live there full time, I certainly wouldn't have wanted my children to live there. I wouldn't have wanted to be pregnant and living there. The levels of radiation are quite high, and we found a very complex picture. So we studied radiation on 4 different atolls, 2 of which were used as nuclear weapons testing sites, Bikini and Eniwetok, and 2 of which had received fallout. They were not the only 2 that received fallout, but they were some of the closest atolls. Certainly, Rongelap was the closest, 100 miles away, and in the path of the fallout winds. 100 miles away from Bikini, and from the Bravo test, the one that I mentioned earlier, the 1,000 times more powerful test than Hiroshima bomb. So we studied Eniwetok, Bikini, Rongelap, and Utrecht is about 300 miles from Bikini. And there was a population living there at the time as well. And we found a very complex picture. We found, parts of Eniwetok where I also mentioned there was a cleanup from 1978 to 1980. Of course, the cleanup led to the Runedome, which is, problematic because there's all this nuclear waste right there in the atoll. There are also indications that some of the waste was actually dumped in the Eniwetok Lagoon rather than all of it being placed in the Runed Dome. But the islands in the south where the cleanup was done, we didn't find evidence of radiation. However, what happened after that cleanup was done, the cleanup meant that they basically removed topsoil, including trees and so on. And then when they tried to grow coconuts and, their kind of food staples, breadfruit, pandanus, those trees now, you know, grow far less, give far less fruit. So it's led to sort of new problems. Then on Bikini, we found high levels of gamma radiation. We also found a lot of cesium-137, which is a radioactive isotope similar chemically to potassium. So when it's present in the soil, the plants take it up. When you eat a coconut that has cesium-137, the cesium-137 incorporates in your soft tissues, including the brain, can lead to this, internal radiation exposure, which is very dangerous. So we found Bikini Island to just absolutely not be a place where one should have a full community living full time. And then we found in Rongala, and currently, Eniwetok, there's a population living in Eniwetok. I forget if it's on the order of it's less than 1,000 people. Let me just say it that way. And then nobody's really living in Bikini. Some occasional caretakers who come in for a period of weeks or months and then leave. Same thing with Rongelap. I think no one's actually even staying in Rongelap long term. And then Utrecht has a population that's living there. And in Utrecht, we didn't find any evidence. We didn't find any evidence of radiation. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be some. And in Rongelap, we found a mixed picture. We found that Rongelap Island, which is the main island, the radiation levels were not zero, but fairly contained, fairly low. And then we found that another island in the north had very high gamma radiation levels and some very high soil radiation levels for different isotopes, including some isotopes of plutonium. So that sort of worried us, because even if you say the Rongelap Island is safe, when people live in an atoll, they also go, they go fishing throughout the atoll. They actually go and pick fruit on other islands. So again, what we ended up finding was a very complex picture. Our first paper came out in 2016. And by the following year, I believe, first paper came out in 2016. By the following year, the Marshall Islands had actually held a conference to discuss the nuclear legacy, and after that actually established a National Nuclear Commission, which has been working on these issues ever since. The Marshall Islands in just the last couple of years was renegotiating its compact of free association with the United States. And as part of that compact, they did receive some additional financial support that I think is in kind of formal documents not described as compensation for the nuclear legacy, but is understood to be that. So that's my understanding. And, if someone from the US government gets mad at me for saying it, that's how I understand it. So I do actually think that, you mentioned Darlene, the Marshall Islands had sort of decades of activism all along the Department of Energy, which was the successor to the Atomic Energy Commission, which had done the testing from 1946 to 1958. The Department of Energy all along had been doing studies, and they were, in the early 2000s, basically concluding everyone can move back and we've done what we needed to do and there's no more danger, kind of thing. And then when our studies came in, and the Marshallese were understandably skeptical and worried and so on. And when our study first study came out in 2016, then we had another series of 2019 and then more since, it was very clear that the narrative of everything's okay was just not holding up. And I do think that had impact and just allowed, empowered the Marshallese people to begin to ask serious questions. And the thing is that, that was one place where testing had been done. And do I think the United States government has done enough for the Marshall Islands? No. But it at least has engaged over time. There are places in the world, whether from U.S. testing or from testing by other nuclear armed or nuclear weapon states, that have received nothing of, basically zero research, basically zero compensation, zero acknowledgement. I mean, what we really need in all of these cases are formal apologies by the governments that tested in those lands, and then real efforts to make things right. And this is part of what I work on at the United Nations. One effort is through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, So this is a treaty that was negotiated in 2017. It entered into force in 2021. Just last Friday, we reached 99 countries that are either party to the treaty or have signed it and are, in the process of ratifying the treaty. That's more than half of all UN eligible member states, all the UN member states that are eligible to join the treaty. So we've got the world's, majority. That treaty, of course, aims to eliminate nuclear weapons, as I've been saying all along, is the ultimate goal. But that treaty also has humanitarian provisions for assisting victims of nuclear weapons use and testing and remediating environments. So one effort is through that treaty, what can we do to help these people that have obviously not been helped by the governments, or not being helped at all, or not being helped enough by the governments that conducted the testing. That we also, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation has been involved in another effort working specifically with the governments of Kiribati and Kazakhstan. I mentioned both of those countries. Kiribati was the site of both US and United Kingdom nuclear testing from 1957 to 1962. Had there been no atmospheric test ban treaty, they probably would have continued testing in Kiribati. But of course, that treaty halted the atmospheric tests there. And then Kazakhstan was the site of Soviet nuclear testing, I think 456. Like, they just had this enormous number of tests that were conducted in majority in the Semipalatinsk test site. That testing program has been estimated to have exposed over 1.5 million people to high levels of radiation, with really just devastating consequences for, of course, the local population, but even beyond. And so Kiribati and Kazakhstan, working with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, just 2 years ago, put forward a resolution in the UN General Assembly that we call the Nuclear Justice Resolution, a resolution on addressing the legacy of nuclear weapons use and testing. It basically, in some sense, has the same goals as the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, humanitarian provisions. How do you accomplish victim assistance and environmental remediation? But rather than just being, discussed among the states that already sort of agree that all of this is a good idea and needs to be done, this is bringing the conversation to the full UN General Assembly, including, of course, the states that have tested. And what's been amazing, so these conversations are going to start again next week. The committee that this resolution gets presented in initially is called the First Committee. That's a committee of the United Nations General Assembly that deals with peace and security. And the resolution the previous 2 years, in each year it gets voted in First Committee and it gets voted in the General Assembly. And so there have been like 4 votes, and each time we've had basically all countries voting, all states voting in favor of the resolution, except for the 9 nuclear armed states. And out of the 9 nuclear armed states, the United Kingdom, France, North Korea, and Russia have been voting against the resolution, whereas the others, including the United States, Israel, India, Pakistan, and China, have been abstaining. So the reason I bring this up is that it's a very interesting way of kind of tackling the nuclear weapons issue, because it's clearly isolating the nuclear armed states from the rest of the world, where the rest of the world, there are countries that are in NATO alongside the United States and United Kingdom and France, and they're of course, allies of Russia and so on. Everybody has been voting for this resolution. Like everyone's been like, okay, I'm with you on this, but like on this one, we're just gonna do the right thing. And I think it's an important beginning of a conversation on, once you acknowledge this enormous harm, like what are your next conclusions? Your next conclusions are we got to make sure this kind of testing never happens again. We got to make sure that these explosions, can never happen again over a city, or, and how do we ensure none of that happens? Yeah, by actually dismantling the arsenals, and by um, accepting that we can no longer just pretend like everything's just going to go fine for the next X number of years or decades. The thing about, you could say now, okay, well, all right, Ivana Hughes, you say, nuclear weapons have been so bad, but we've had 80 years of, nothing happening. And what that ignores is the dozens of incidents that we've had where we've gone really, really, really close to nuclear weapons used by deliberately, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, including deliberately and accidentally in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then all kinds of other incidents, including computer glitches, um, including, Soviet Union in 1983. There was an incident called Able Archer where NATO was conducting these exercises where they kind of raised the bar for how real the exercises were going to be, and the Soviet Union was getting all this intel and thinking it was under attack, and it was literally loading nuclear warheads onto, whatever missile bombers, etc. And so yeah, so we've, in some sense, many people in the field describe this as 80 years of luck. And, that luck, we touched on this a little bit earlier, that luck is going to run out. Like you can have something that's very unlikely to happen, and it still happens. And if the
Yeah.
stakes are, all of humanity, then we better do something about it, and do it soon.
Have you seen the latest Mission Impossible movie?
I haven't. I told you I don't have time to watch movies.
So there's a scenario in which AI takes over, and then nukes were about to go flying from every country. So I was just thinking, can that scenario play out? Yeah.
I
And
mean,
is there any place safe on this earth? I don't think there's any place safe on this earth, because
no.
even if you are somewhere in New Zealand, the atmosphere is going to be destroyed after that anyway.
Absolutely. I've been asked about billionaires who build bunkers, or millionaires who build bunkers in New Zealand. And I keep saying, like, maybe they should send some money to peace organizations.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
That might be a much better investment of their wealth. It's not going to be good, because you could be in a bunker and, but you're going to have to come on surface and get some food, and it's going to be a different earth. It will be impacted by nuclear winter.
Correct.
The temperatures will go down, and maybe in New Zealand it won't be so bad. Maybe some food will still grow, but you'd have nuclear winter plus nuclear famine, because if food doesn't grow in most of the northern hemisphere, forget it. We're all going to starve, which is, why we talk about the end of it all. There's going to be radiation. There's going to be destruction of the ozone layer in a, war in which the US and Russia use 1/3 of their current arsenals. We end up with 70% of the ozone layer destroyed. That ends up meaning that when the wealthy person comes out of the bunker in New Zealand, they're not going to be able to just, they're going to have some kind of mask and cover their entire body. And then on top of it, that ozone layer destruction, the UV radiation, will actually also destroy plants. So it's going to be a kind of double whammy on food production, where now maybe your plants, it's just too much UV radiation for your plants to even grow, to even have any food. So this is not, I mean, anyone who thinks like, and you hear these things about the US, oh, how could we win a nuclear war kind of thing, like really crazy stuff coming out of mouths of, people involved in the military. Um, uh, you can't win a nuclear war, and nobody should be thinking like, oh, how am I gonna survive so that I can then, like have a life afterwards. You're not gonna have a life. Like just forget it. It's Khrushchev is often quoted as having said, the survivors will and be the dead, people say things like, I'm just going to walk towards the blast, like the sooner the better kind of thing. I mean, of course, most of us are built to want to survive, right? But it's just, I cannot possibly imagine how this would ever be a world in which you would want to, to live. It's just going to be, it's not the world we live in today. Let's just put it that way. It's a
Right.
very, very different world.
Do people ever call you Dr. Doom?
Uh, I think, I mean, I've seen different comments, like when I do an interview or something, like, oh, she's such a bundle of joy. I actually am a person. I love life. I love people. I'm not it's precisely, I don't even, yeah, just as I described this, I'm not even afraid of like, what motivates me is not fear of nuclear war. It's actually love for humanity. It's love even for this country, that the United States, that I criticize so much. I love the United States. It gave me, I shared with you, gave me so many amazing things. And for me, the motivation is all in love and prosperity and future, not in, oh, I'm afraid we're all gonna die. Like, if we all die, that's it, like, let's think about surviving, and let's think about having a planet for future generations. That's what motivates me. But Dr. Doom, maybe now I'm Dr. Tears. Sorry.
Okay, that's a good way of thinking about things. So, what's your advice for young scientists or engineers or people in the technical field?
I mean, I think my advice for every young person is to, to find something you're really passionate about, to find something you're really contributing to find meaning in your life. I do really think that, there is no one right way to live a meaningful life. There are many different ways. I've found a lot of joy in having a family. I've found a lot of joy in teaching. I've found now, some level of joy. I said it's very hard in being passionate about this issue and advocating for it. I just think people have to find what's right for them. That's not always easy. And as I've said, I was a young person during a very optimistic time, and maybe it's, in some sense, it's a tall order for me to tell young people now to, find their passions and so on, when they got to pay bills and have, other things to worry about. But I do think that when one, pursues their passions and pursues something that's important to them, that, a lot of meaning can be gained. And maybe the fact that we are in the world is in such a kind of crisis mode, maybe that opens up real opportunities for us to solve some of these problems that have been so intractable for so long, and for young people to find a way of contributing. You don't have to contribute to nuclear disarmament, although I would love it if you do. You're making a contribution by talking to people from all kinds of fields and walks of life, and you're learning, but you're also importantly helping your audience to learn about topics that are important. And I think we all, in some sense, I think for me, it goes back to this sense of responsibility, especially for those of us who feel like we have a sense of privilege. Maybe there are people who just quite simply have to work 2 jobs to make ends meet, and they're not going to be, contributing to a better world. Although, the person who runs my food through a register, they're making a contribution too. Like, I couldn't eat if there was no grocery store in which I buy groceries. Like, so in some sense, we actually all are contributing to a better world. We just have to turn away from contributing in ways that are destructive. I've read a lot of things written about peace and so on, and I'm now forgetting if this was maybe this was a JFK quote, of wars will end when those people who resist, like war resistors, are respected as much as the warriors. Like, we still glorify, and that's not to say that I don't respect. Of course I do. Like, the people who fought in wars and veterans in this country, and who took on so much, and gave of themselves and lost of themselves, some in body parts, some in mental health, some in other ways. Of course they are to be respected, but we also have to just kind of get back, like, we shouldn't be making more of them. We should be trying to end that kind of way of dealing with world problems, and turn to cooperation, turn to negotiations, give the United Nations, have a kind of reform of the United Nations that allows it to be effective in actually stopping and ending wars, and preventing, illegal wars, et cetera, et cetera.
No, that's a very nice suggestion, nice advice, and that's a very good way, optimistic way of looking at life, I guess. I've taken so much of your time. I really thank you. I have so many questions, but I'm very aware of your busy schedule.
Time. Yeah,
another time. That will be awesome. Yeah, that will
some
be
more
awesome.
Guests, and we can talk at some point.
Yeah, that will be awesome. So again, yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. I know you have a very busy schedule.
Absolutely. I'm delighted.
And good luck with the disarmament. I hope you succeed someday, maybe soon.
It's not going to happen tomorrow, but on the order of years. I want to wake up in 2045. I hope I'll be alive. I shouldn't have a problem living to that age, although of course one never knows. But I hope I wake up in 2045 in a world without nuclear weapons. That
would be awesome.
Something
that would be awesome.
All right. Thank you, Ali.
First we got the bomb, and that was good, 'cause we love peace and motherhood. Then Russia got the bomb, but that's okay, 'cause the balance of power's maintained that way. Who's next? France got the bomb, but don't you grieve, 'cause they're on our side, I believe. China got the bomb, but have no fears, they can't wipe us out for at least 5 years. Who's next? Then Indonesia claimed that they were going to get one any day. South Africa wants 2, that's right. 1 for the black and 1 for the white. Who's next? Egypt's gonna get one too, just to use on you-know-who. So Israel's getting tense, wants one in self-defense. The Lord is our shepherd, says the psalm, but just in case, we better get a bomb. Who's the next? Luxembourg is next to go, and who knows, maybe Monaco. We'll try to stay serene and calm when Alabama gets the bomb. Who's next? Who's next?